got my tubes cloned across my sphere. So it's looking pretty good, but if I tumble my view around, I can see at the top I've got this tight circular cluster of clones. And if I look at the bottom, I've got the same thing there as well. I really want an even distribution of clones, sort of like what it looks like around the middle here. I don't want these clusters of clones at the top and the bottom. Now the reason that that is happening, if I turn off my cloner, is that the geometry of the sphere has got edges that go around it and edges that go up and down that meet at these poles at the top and the bottom. Now because I'm cloning onto each edge, we end up with a cluster of these clones at the top and the bottom. Luckily what I can do is come to my sphere, and under its object tab, rather than just have a standard sphere, I can change it to what's called an icosahedron. That's a sphere made up of triangular tiled shapes, and if you have a look at these from all different angles, we can see that they don't join at one point, or they don't cluster together anywhere. They're fairly evenly distributed across the surface of the sphere. So if I turn my cloner back on now we've got this more regular distribution of clones across the surface. So that's looking pretty good. Now the next thing I want to deal with is how my animation of my clones works, and in particular scaling these clones along their length. What I want to do is be able to put a plane effector on and lengthen these clones. If I select my cloner and go MoGraph effector plane, if I go into its parameters and change it to a scaling effect, I'm going to scale it along the y-axis. Now we've got a little bit of a problem here. If I scale a long way up along the y-axis, I'm getting this extra geometry come through the sphere and hit my clones, and it looks a little unusual, and it's not something I really want happening. What's happening there is the clones, they're scaling not only outwards from their tops, but inwards towards the center as well. Now if I turn the number of segments on my sphere down, and if I hide the sphere, I'll just go into its basic tab and I can make it off in the editor. Now there we can see our clones now. If I go back to my plane effector, when I adjust the scale value, not only are the ends, the top ends facing outwards, they're scaling outwards, but the bottom ends are scaling inwards. I don't want that to happen. The reason that's happening is because the tubes themselves, their pivot point is in the middle, or their axis is in the middle, and so they're scaling evenly out both ends. I don't want that. I just want it to scale it from the bottom upwards. So there's a little bit of a trick that we can do with our cloner to fool it into thinking that the tube is sitting flat on the grid, and it's going to scale only from the top. What we need to do is create a null first of all. So let's go create object null. So null, remember, it's an empty group, it doesn't do anything on its own, and here it is sitting at the origin. I'm going to put my tube into the null. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to select just my tube, and I'm going to move it upwards so that its base is sitting pretty much on the grid. So if we look at this hierarchy, we've now got a tube sitting in a null, and the null's pivot point is at the base. Now the cloner, when we put this in the cloner just reads this top object here. It doesn't look inside the hierarchy, it just says this is the object, and what it's seeing here is a tube with a pivot point at the bottom. So now when it scales, it will scale only upwards and not downwards as well. So the tube is in the null's pivot point is on the origin, XYZ0. Now we can put the null into the cloner, and let's turn this cloner back on. And let's have a look at what we've got going on with our plane effector now. So if we scale our plane effector outwards, now we've got something a little odd happening here. What's happening is if we have a look at our clones, they're not scaling upwards, they're scaling inwards. So I think the original clones are rotated in the wrong direction. Our clones are going, they're upside down basically, because we're having to scale in a negative axis. The way that we can fix this is go back to our cloner, and remember at the start we used the rotation tools to get these clones facing the right way on the surface. If I click and drag this around, and I want to go to 270 degrees, So now that means my clones have been rotated, so the base of them is sitting on the surface of the sphere. If we go back to this plane effector, now if we start to scale them, now we've got the scale working in the right axis. So we put the tube inside the null, sitting on the grid, on the XYZ 0 origin axis. That null then goes into our cloner, and you may just need to go into the cloner and in its transform tab just adjust the rotation until you get these clones sitting flat on the surface of the sphere, and our plane effector is now scaling these clones outwards and not inwards and back through itself. So this is working now. This is great. What I'll do is I'll just go back to my sphere and I'll add some more sections or segments into my sphere. Sometimes when we do this, you can see our clones don't update. Sometimes you need to maybe turn your cloner off and back on again just to force it to recalculate any changes you might have made to the objects in it. Okay, so now we've got our cloner and we're using this trick of putting our clone object into a null. That basically means we can shift the pivot point of that clone object around and we can get it working correctly across the surface of our cloned object.